Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. We spend so much time on this show talking about, how to actually put together all these different systems and plans and everything when it comes to business continuity. But what happens, like, once you've got it all set up? You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
it's not a set it and forget it kind of thing.
Right. You can't just, like, put it in a binder and stick it on the shelf and say, all right, we're good.
Yeah.
Because the reality is things change, right? The threats change, your business changes, the world changes.
Absolutely.
And so what we're going to be looking at today in this deep dive is this really critical piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
We're looking at Clause 10 of ISO 22301.2019.
Right.
And this is the clause all about improvement. So how do you make sure that your business continuity management system, your BCMS, is actually getting better over time?
Exactly. And I think the comparison here is maybe like you've got a great BCMS in place. It's really good for today.
Right.
But if you don't have that kind of continuous improvement, you don't have that process in place, it's almost like having a phone from, 10 years ago, state of the art 10 years ago, but doesn't really cut it anymore.
Right. Yeah.
So Clause 10 really gives you that roadmap for that continual evolution. And so we're going to sort of step through it. It's like almost how we might step through it if we were doing like a training session or something. Really sort of like clause by clause to make sure that people really understand how to actually embed that.
Yeah, so our mission today is to really clearly kind of lay out what the standard requires when it comes to, first of all, dealing with issues. And the standard uses this very specific word, nonconformity, which I think
Yes.
is important to unpack. And then how do we kind of build that mindset, that culture of continual improvement within our business continuity management system?
Absolutely.
All right, so let's start off, like I said, with section 10.1. And 10.1 deals with this idea of nonconformity and corrective action.
Okay.
Now, the standard, like I said, uses this specific term nonconformity, which I think it's helpful just to kind of be clear on what that means. And in simple terms, a nonconformity is defined in 22331 as the non-fulfillment of a requirement.
Right.
So basically, anytime something in your BCMS is not meeting the standard that you've set for yourself, that is a nonconformity.
Yeah.
So there's a gap between what should be and what is.
Exactly. And Clause 10.1 tells us what your organization shall do when you have one of those gaps, when you have one of those
Yeah.
nonconformities.
Right.
And it's more than just sort of saying, oops, we messed up.
Yeah.
It really is that structured approach to fixing the immediate problem and then preventing it from happening again. So first of all, you've got to react to the nonconformity.
Yeah.
This might be taking action to contain it,
Yeah.
correct it if that's applicable, deal with the consequences.
Right. So it's like if you had like a small fire breakout in your office or something.
Right.
You're not just going to sit there and be like, oh, well, you're going to, grab the fire extinguisher and you're going to make sure everyone's safe and you're going to,
Take action.
yeah, you're going to react to the situation.
Absolutely.
So you've got to react.
Take action, yeah.
Put out the flames, put out the proverbial flames, deal with the immediate damage or, the immediate problem. But then, like we all know from putting out fires, you don't just want to put the fire out.
Right.
You want to figure out, like, what caused it in the first place.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where this next bit comes in, where you need to evaluate the need for action to eliminate the cause or the causes of the nonconformity. And the point of that is to make sure that it doesn't recur, that it doesn't happen again, or that it doesn't occur elsewhere. So, it's not just a one-off, So there's a few things that you're going to need to do here. First of all, you're going to need to review and analyze the nonconformity. So what happened? When did it happen? Who was involved? All that kind of thing.
Right. So it's like the detective work for your BCMS. Like,
Yeah.
okay, what happened here?
Exactly. And once you've done that, then you need to determine the causes of the nonconformity. And you might need to ask why a few times to get to the root cause. If a backup failed, well, why did the backup fail?
Right.
Oh, well, the server crashed.
Yeah.
Well, why did the server crash?
Right.
Oh, well, it was, the power supply went, but then you say, well, why did the power supply go?
Right.
Or you could say, well, why wasn't this backup done properly? Well, actually, we didn't train the staff properly.
Right.
So, getting to that root cause is really important. And this is also the time to ask yourself, okay, could this happen elsewhere in the system?
Right. Yeah.
Are there similar situations?
Yeah. So you're not just fixing this one little instance.
Right.
You're looking for like broader patterns and potential, weaknesses.
Yeah. And then you're going to implement any action needed. And again, this might be updating a procedure. It might be buying new technology, providing training, restructuring responsibilities, whatever it is that your analysis shows that you need to do.
Yeah.
You then need to review the effectiveness of any corrective action you've taken.
Yeah.
You know, you can't just say, oh, well, we've done that now.
Right. You got to check that your fix actually fixed the problem.
Exactly. Did it actually achieve what you wanted it to? You know, has that nonconformity been eliminated? Are you confident that it won't happen again? And again, that might mean that you're monitoring some metrics, you're doing some follow-up checks or whatever. And then finally, you need to make changes to the business continuity management system if necessary.
Right.
So if it's highlighted, if going through this nonconformity has highlighted a fundamental flaw in the design of your BCMS, then you're going to need to go back and actually change the system.
Yeah, so dealing with a nonconformity, it's not just like a quick patch.
No.
It's like a whole cycle of identifying the problem, figuring out why it happened, putting in place the things to fix it, and then verifying, okay, yeah, that actually worked.
Yeah. And you're right. It's that whole cycle that will then lead to a more robust BCMS. It's about learning from your mistakes.
Right.
And the standard actually gives us a definition of corrective action in 3.9. It says that it's action to eliminate the cause of a nonconformity and to prevent recurrence.
Right.
So again, it's about stopping it from happening again.
So it's not just about reacting to the situation.
No.
It's about putting in place preventative measures to stop that thing from ever happening again.
Absolutely.
Now, a really important part of this whole process is record keeping. So what does 10.1 say that we need to be documenting?
Okay. So the standard says that you shall retain documented information as evidence of a couple of things. So first of all, the nature of the nonconformities and any subsequent actions taken. So what was the nonconformity? What did you do to initially correct it? What did your analysis of the root cause show? What corrective actions did you put in place? And then the results of any corrective action. So how do you know that that's been effective?
Right.
So you need to document all of that. And that documentation then becomes really useful for internal learning.
Right. So the records aren't just paperwork.
No.
They're actually evidence.
Evidence, yeah.
Both that you're doing the thing, and then it gives you something to go back to and look at and learn from.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about what to do when things go wrong, but how do we go about making things better when there isn't necessarily a specific problem staring us in the face?
Right.
So this brings us to section 10.2, which is continual improvement.
Yeah. So this is where this idea of recurring activity to enhance performance comes in. That's how the standard defines continual improvement. And this word recurring is really important here. It's not a one-off project.
Yeah.
It really has to be that ongoing mindset. And Clause 10.2 tells us that the organization shall continually improve the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the business continuity management system. And it's really important to understand what those three things are. Suitability means that it's the right BCMS for your organization and its context and objectives. Adequacy means that you've got the right scope, resources, processes, all of that in place. And effectiveness is, well, does it actually work? You know, does it achieve what it's supposed to achieve?
So continual improvement has to touch on all those bases.
Yes.
It's making sure that the BCMS fits, that it has what it needs, and that it actually works.
Exactly. So how do you do this continual improvement? Well, the introduction to 2D301 gives us some clues. So it talks about monitoring and reviewing the performance and effectiveness of the business continuity management system. But that's not a passive thing. It's actually going out and looking at the data, looking at the trends, analyzing, is this working? And then Clause 9.1, monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation really feeds into that.
Right.
You need to be tracking things.
Yeah.
You need to be tracking your recovery times or the success rate of tests or, how many disruptions you've experienced. And all of that data that helps you figure out where you need to improve.
Right, so you're using data to guide your improvement efforts.
Yes.
Not just like a gut feeling of like, oh, I think we need to work on this. It's like, no, the numbers are telling us this is where we need to focus.
Yeah. And then it also stresses that you shall act on the outcomes of that monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation. So if your monitoring shows that something's not working, then you need to change it. You need to do something about it. So that might be refining your BIA. It might be updating risk assessments, revising your strategies or your plans or your exercises, whatever it is.
Now, I'm assuming that, the insights that you get from doing audits, both internal audits that you do yourself, as well as if you're going for certification, external audits,
Yes.
those also play a big role in identifying areas for improvement. Right?
Absolutely. So Clause 9.2, which is that internal audit, that's a key driver of continual improvement. And the point of an audit is to determine, does the BCMS actually conform to the requirements of ISO 22301, And is it actually being implemented and maintained properly? And that might find nonconformities. That
Mhm.
might say, actually, you're not meeting the standard here. But it might also just point to, actually, you could do this better. And those findings then become an input to continual improvement.
Yeah.
And similarly, 9.3, management review. That's another thing that really feeds into continual improvement. So top management have to review the BCMS regularly.
Mm.
And one of the outputs from management review might be, here are some things we're going to do to improve.
Right. So it's like all these different parts of the standard, the regular monitoring, the internal checks through audits, the high-level overview through management review.
Yeah.
They're all kind of feeding into the central purpose of making the BCMS better. It's a system that is designed to learn and evolve.
Yeah. And it really fits in nicely with that Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle that we talk about in ISO standards a lot. So you
Yeah.
plan your BCMS, you implement it, you check how it's doing, and then you act on the results of that check to make it even better.
Right.
Continual improvement means that it's not a static document, but that it really is a dynamic system.
Right. It's a living thing. It's a living thing that's constantly, changing and adapting to keep up with the changing world around it.
Absolutely.
Okay. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Clause 10, what are the key takeaways that we should be kind of walking away with?
So I think the main takeaway from 10.1, nonconformity and corrective action, is that when something goes wrong, when you're not meeting the requirements, you need to react quickly. You need to contain it, correct it, deal with any consequences.
Mm-hmm.
But then you need to do that thorough investigation.
Mm-hmm.
Why did it happen? How can we stop it from happening again? And you need to document all of that.
Right.
And then from 10.2, I think the takeaway there is that continual improvement is an ongoing process.
Yeah.
It's about making sure that your BCMS is suitable, adequate, and effective. And we do that by constantly monitoring how it's performing, acting on what we learn, and using things like audits and management review to drive that change.
So it's two sides of the same coin. There's fixing what's broken and then there's making it better. And it's that continual improvement that really transforms your business continuity from just like a set of plans. It's like this living capability that can adapt and survive.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that makes it a really valuable asset to any organization.
All right. So with that in mind, what's one action an organization could take to really start fostering a culture where they're thinking about potential weaknesses and how to address those? Something to think about. And thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Clause 10.